If you want to see more beautiful buildings, you have to embrace technology, and you're going to have to embrace a lot of AI. The big question mark, what drove us to abandon a way of building and led to the state of affairs we're in? A lot of the billionaires DM me that they want to create like 10 sculptures in a mansion that has a $2 million sculpture budget.
AI, robots, and traditional architecture and stone carving. I've got Micah Springut on today, founder of Monumental Labs, who is just a really incredible pioneer and innovator who's brought some of the most advanced robots from Italy to the United States and is now producing for a little over a year now some just incredible architectural pieces, art pieces, statues, all sorts of stuff. So we get into what he's doing, what's possible with what he's doing, where it's heading with robots and AI and architecture. And we also talk about the philosophical implications of some of this and the ethical implication, and also some of the controversies around it. It was a really great conversation. I look forward to sharing with you. And here's Micah. Well, Micah, thank you for coming on the podcast. I've been excited to talk to you about this.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Cool. So to start off, can you start off by just telling everyone, what is Monumental Labs? What are you up to? And kind of when did you start and where are you at now?
Sure. Monumental Labs is basically, it's almost a year-old company at this point. We're building robotic stone carving factories, the goal of which is to unleash a renaissance in art and architecture and aesthetics, and later to build buildings out of masonry, of mass masonry. We're starting with a few robots in the New York area, doing work for architects, for artists, for individuals commissioning large sculptures and small sculptures. We're getting our start doing all of this fine detail work with these 7-axis CNC robots. And we're working on building out more automation, more AI into the process to make this process even more efficient, so that in the future we'll be building cities that are highly ornamented, extremely ornate if we want them to be, and eventually built out of stone themselves. And it's just the beginning of that process. And I envision next several decades us scaling up what we can do with the number of robots we have, with the types of robots we have, and with the automation that we're building into them.
Man, that's cool. So it sounds like you already have several robots, because when I first talked to you, I don't know, a couple years ago, and then a year ago, you bought your first one. So you've got multiple now.
We got our first one in June. Our second one came last month and is just getting up and running now.
Wow.
We've basically filled up the space we currently have. We're working inside this stone fabrication facility that's been around since 1927. But we've kind of filled up everything with studio and robot space and office space. And so we actually now need a much bigger place to hopefully house 5 to 10 robots and a whole bunch of wire saws and other types of saws to really do this on a much bigger scale.
Very cool. So I actually want to dive into a little bit of technical stuff and ask some technical questions about this, and then kind of want to get to some of the philosophical things and implications. But when it comes to robotics, and this is one of the things that I understand, what a robot does, generally speaking, with stone cutting, and we'll put some pictures and video for people watching so they can actually see it. But how does AI come into that? Like, how does someone communicate to you what they're trying to do? What do they hand over to you that you're able to turn into a carving?
So we're currently using a pretty old technology, CNC technology. These are robots that understand the XYZ plane. You feed them a digital file, and it uses these diamond-tipped bits that just rotate at 6,000 or 7,000 revolutions per minute, and it mills away the stone. It's not lasers, it's not water jets, it's good old diamond-tipped bits. And we take that digital file, we get it perfect, we are forming it inside our digital software, whether that's ZBrush or Rhino or what have you. And then we're giving it to the machine, and then we're programming it. We're telling it, how do we attack this piece of stone? What size tools? What are our strategies for what angles we go in? Um, what are the steps and the depths in which we're milling? And we do that all very much manually today. It's not something new, and it's still very, very labor intensive. But the technology has been getting better and better to the point that we can buy robot arms off the shelf, do them up a bit, get some software on there, have the right end effectors, have the right electro spindle geared towards stone, and make these carve and be very efficient at carving. The next step, and where it gets really interesting, is when you start to automate this process. Automation both on the tool path, so we don't have to tell the robot, hey, you need to take an 8 millimeter bit and go over this with this amount of spacing. It can just learn from what we've done in the past and what our intention is and automate these tool paths. And beyond that, it's attaching sensors to these robots so they can see what's in front of them, understand the world in front of them, and then start to work strategies and understand what's happening, and so take more efficient paths. For example, instead of having to use a tool that slowly spins and goes along a surface, you could actually pick up a chisel and have that robot chisel it away, because chiseling is actually more efficient. You can move whole chunks of stone a lot quicker if you have the right tool. So once we get into that domain of robots that understand the world, it's going to be even way cheaper than we're doing now. And we've already gotten it at least on par with sculpture being made pre-war, and probably half as cheap already of what people were doing in 1920, 1910.
That's incredible. What's kind of, do you know, and it might depend on what you're doing, but kind of the division between materials and labor? Because as you're saying, it's still pretty labor intensive.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're buying natural stone, marble or something, that could be expensive too. So what's kind of that breakup? Because I'm curious, what, as you get labor costs down, what does that do to overall price?
Overall, the cost of the robots themselves, the cost of the stone, the cost to run the water and the electricity are minimal compared to the labor costs. Everything is labor costs. We don't have to touch the efficiency of the robots or get the robots themselves cheaper. We need to make the machines smarter so that they can replace some of the rote tasks that humans do.
Wow.
That's not designing the pieces, but that is deciding, how do we mill these pieces efficiently without you having to sit there, wait for it to calculate, press another button, load another tool, etc.
Man, so what type, and it might be a wide range, and you could talk about that range of like, what type of things are people ordering? Are they ordering cornices, or are they ordering fountains and multiple pieces, or one piece, or statues? What are people ordering, and what are you guys capable of doing?
Yeah, our business basically has 3 or 4 different components right now. Probably the biggest right now is artists, established artists who either they work in stone but don't have time to carve things by hand, or they've never worked in stone before, but they're sculptors who have worked in bronze or plaster or clay or terracotta and want to be doing stone, or they're completely new to doing things in 3D and now they can do stone. The next is, we also do wealthy individuals come to us and say, hey, I've got this magnificent mansion. It needs some sculpture in it. And we design it. Sometimes we'll farm it out to an artist that they like, but oftentimes we'll design it in-house and do one-off commissions that way. And then we do restoration. We've done restoration for the Palace Hotel here in New York, the Villard houses. That one's you can see on our social media pages. We've got a couple big ones coming up. I can't say them yet, but historical, big-time New York City landmarks that are getting refreshed, or their pediments, or their something broke or was worn off, and we're creating it anew. And we also have new builds. We are, for example, we're one of the coolest projects. We're working with Robert A. M. Stern Architects on design for a new residential college at the University of Michigan. Going on that building, and dining hall, and going on that building, there's a tower, and we're putting 6 statues / gargoyles, whatever you want to call them, all made out of wolverines. And so we've got these very interesting designs for those, which we'll release soon, and you'll start to be able to see those pictures.
Wow. What are there specific limitations with the robots right now that might change in the future, or maybe they're just kind of inherent, they'll kind of be there, at least for the foreseeable future? And I remember when we were first talking, it was, hey, the robot could get it to a certain point, and then you kind of hand it over to people to do some of the finer grain detail to smooth out whatever. Like, what's kind of that difference there, and do you see that changing over the next 5, 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the limitation of all these CNC machines is that because they don't understand what's in front of them, they have no sensors, no video to see what's happening. They're dependent on being perfectly calibrated at every step, and that never really happens. You always get some sort of miscalibration. You get misregistration. So you'll have a surface that's different. It's not quite at the same level as another surface, and you'll see these lines, and they don't polish anything. So it looks a little janky when it comes off the mill. It's not a finished piece by any means, at least in marble. And so then that's where hand carvers come in, and they're using rasps, and they're using chisels, and they're using sandpaper, and they're using they're using Dremel tools, and all sorts of interesting power tools and non-power tools to kind of get that surface finished, to go into crevices and get some of the material out that the robot can't reach. Uh, I will say that does get easier when you're working in stones like limestone, where you don't see the surface level as deeply, or it's a little softer, or when you're doing very broad planes like you do for architectural sculpture. So fine art, you absolutely need to spend time and money on hand carving. In architecture, you can dial that way back, especially if it's going up high in a building. Um, but that's going to be there even when we have sensors. It's not going to be perfect, and you're going to want to have a little hand carving on it. I
Right.
think we've stopped caring as much about getting a perfect finish on things because there are so many talented hand carvers that can help finish it for us. At some point, there will be a bottleneck, but right now we're taking amazing art students who have been working in clay and 3D, and sometimes have been working in stone prior to working with us, and turning them into hand finishers and hand carvers. And that pipeline is there's so much talent there that it's not the most necessary thing that we work on that aspect of things. I'll talk about what we might be working on in the future, and I think it's more being able to cut massive blocks of stone into large cornices without having to have a human operator measure it 8 times and line it up and make sure the laser is going on it and eyeball it. I think it's more important that we can build buildings out of stone again than get fine art to a level that doesn't require a human.
Right. And this is really interesting because it's, we talk a lot about building culture, about blending the best of old and new, but it's not just about being nostalgic or being a Luddite or something, and just copying. We don't build like the Romans built because, we live in a different world and we have different technologies. We don't build like we did 500 years ago because we've got new things, but at the same time, not assuming that everything new is better, because that's also part of the problem where it's just, hey, everything new is better. Technology is the savior of all. And so we always talk about blending the best of old and new. And man, you're really like on the extremes of that, doing like traditional architecture and art that hasn't been done or not done at scale in a very long time. And then also like the cutting edge of AI and robots, which is pretty cool. Like, how did you get into this? What inspired you? What made you want to do this? And also what made you think it was going to be a good business model?
The inspiration is, I grew up in New York. I admired the craftsmanship you see just walking around most neighborhoods where something is old. And I always wondered, well, why don't we build like this anymore? Why don't we have these beautiful things that seemingly we know how to do, or we knew how to do, and they just don't appear in our environment anymore? So I wondered about this for a long time. I didn't do much about it. I guess the thing I did about it was not go to architecture school and not become an architect, because I saw what buildings I was more likely to build as an architect, as a contemporary architect. Um, and so I avoided it. I worked in tech. I built internet companies, but I always thought about doing something in this space. And around 2018, 2019, I said, I'm going to learn how to carve. I'm going to learn how this works, how does stone work. I started taking classes at the Art Students League here in New York. And I picked up a hammer and chisel and started carving away faces and busts and little demos of pieces of David's eye and bunches of grapes that you might see on the side of a building. And it's so fascinating to be steeped in that old craft. And then you realize, boy, this is never going to make it in real estate. This is slow. This is arduous. Uh, you can't pay people. You can't pay people wages that would make this cost effective enough for even high end developers to incorporate this in their build. And that's unfortunate, but it's also a good thing that people get paid more nowadays, and they don't live in squalor, and everybody has TV and internet and phones, and so you have to find a new way. So I was in tech. I think, we've got to automate this. There's got to be a way that this is done. I thought maybe I'd have to build some of this stuff from scratch and take some robot arms and figure out how to mill. But luckily, there is this burgeoning group of artisans and technologists in Italy, of all places. That's where the marble industry is focused. Who are building these robots, who have been playing with them. A lot of times they're just little projects that a stone fabricator put together. And I went out there and I started learning from them and seeing what they did to operate, how what they could accomplish with a particular robot. And eventually we settled on a company we liked using and started working with them to build our robots and bring them over here to the United States. So we got trained and we became the first company here in the US to get these amazing Italian robots here. And that's the origin story.
I love that. I love that you actually went, hey, taking classes, learning how to, just learning the actual medium first and then jumping into the automation because you actually understand the fundamentals, before figuring out how to automate it.
And then you get new fundamentals, right? Like you can do new things with the robot that you can't really do with a chisel. There's certain places you can't reach with a chisel, but you can put like 500 millimeter long tool cone like directly behind a statue and get parts and do intricate work at a depth that you would never be able to do by hand. So there's ways you can do things and new ways you can exploit these robots to do new types of art. You can make things more complicated. What looks complicated to the human eye does not look complicated to the robot. So you can do certain things that you wouldn't even dare do by hand because it's just too much work. You can make things bigger. At scale, there's just so much labor to remove, the material for an 8-foot tall sculpture that would take you years to do. And it takes us like 11, 12 days. So you can dream bigger. Artists aren't limited to building something this size. They can build something that's, 10 feet tall, 12 feet tall and make it work.
What's so cool about what you're talking about, because I want to get into next kind of a little bit of controversy about like certain people, just, I don't know, unhappy about this, but like everything you're saying is talking about how essentially it's a tool, just like, a Dremel is a tool or, a hole saw, whatever, that opens up more human creativity and more artistic ability and opportunity. It's not limiting or not taking away. Is that how you perceive it?
Yeah. I mean, here in New York and the United States in general, stone carving as an art was dead. There was almost nobody doing it at a scale and selling marble. Everybody was doing bronze. There's still people doing a ton of bronze, or there are people that go out to Italy and work there in the mountains and can churn out some stuff. And there's still great sculptors all over the world. But functionally in the US, it was a dying or dead industry. Everything became so expensive. Artists didn't want to do it. They didn't have time to throw away a year of their life working on a particular sculpture, and they're not going to get 10x the return on it from doing a bronze or doing something in plaster. So they weren't doing it. And all of a sudden, we brought it back, and we're working with a dozen or 24 now artists who are taking their ideas that they've done in 3D and putting them into marble. On the building front, this project for Ramza for Robert A. M. Stewart Architects, it either would not have been done or would have been done in like poured like faux stone, like concrete, right. And it would have looked not great. It would have looked terrible. And we wouldn't have thought it was that great, and we'd just move on and say, I guess we can't do the things that we used to do anymore. And we'd hang our heads and talk about the good old days. But it's not the case. We don't have to do that anymore. If you're worried about the loss of craft, just figure out what the robot can do and add craft back into it. There's so many ways to still have hand carving in there. It's just a matter of scale and level of complexity that you can now achieve.
It's interesting, there's a lot of, not maybe a lot, but people I know, high quality, very talented tradesmen that are in traditional craft and stuff, um, don't like when people refer to things as dying or a dead trade, which I do as well. I
Mm-hmm.
refer to things like, hey, it's a dying trade, it's a dead trade. And they talk about how that's, I don't know, disenfranchising for young people or something. And I don't know. I kind of been with you though, that it's just like, okay, maybe there's 10 people in the US, maybe there's 100 people in the US kind of doing this, these, stone carving or whatever, or maybe even more. But functionally, as a builder and developer myself, I can tell you, like, it doesn't like it. Okay, maybe a few people know how to do it, but that's not what I mean when I say that is a dying trade. If it's not accessible for
So,
people, and if it's only accessible for the 0.0001%, um, then to me, it's functionally dead. And so that's what to me, you're really like revitalizing a trade by introducing a new tool that opens up all sorts of possibilities and another kind of, controversy, which this one I don't know, it's interesting controversy, but, you know, there's this kind of narrative that being a tradesman is just the most like romantic thing that you could possibly do. And I think there's elements of truth to that. If you're doing like really artistic work and a tradesman and there's so much, honor and hard work and being out there every day. But a lot of this stuff, if you're looking at how things were built a long time ago, and there's basically an assembly line of really poorly paid people sitting with a chisel all day long, working on the exact same corners over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, like, is that like the most dignified way they can live? And I'm not saying it's not dignified. I'm just saying introducing a robot, I'm not sure it's actually all that dehumanizing. I don't know. What's your take on that? And I know it's, your company and you're doing this, but I'm just curious what you
I
think
mean,
about that.
so first off, the people who have these criticisms are basically, I look at their work and it's like I have so much respect for them. Like they're like the heroes of keeping the knowledge alive. And what they want for the environment and what they want it to look like is often exactly what I want, which is put the human hand back into the built environment. I am tired of a flat plane. I'm tired of things that look like they came off a machine and we're just there because the efficiency of the machine is do a right angle and put a straight line. And, a clean line is just a machine aesthetic. And so I'm with them on that.
Oh,
Where we disagree is the way to get that to continue insisting that we don't use technology to the point that you become irrelevant to new buildings. You're not going to be irrelevant to historic restoration because when they tell you to restore a building to its historic state, you do it and you pay whatever it takes and you have to. And that's where these people make their living. But beyond that, nobody is thinking, oh, I'm going to make a new building out of stone today. And that's the problem. That's why it's dead, is because there's nothing new coming out of it, and nobody can afford to think of it as something fresh and new that can do and add to the pantheon of great buildings. And so if we let's face facts about where we're not seeing a lot of great new stone buildings popping up. We're seeing a lot of glass, maybe some cool things with terracotta skins, maybe some cool tile, if we're lucky. But
but that's not the majority. That's, sub 10% maybe, you know, of new construction.
if you want to see more beautiful buildings, you have to embrace technology, and you're going to have to embrace a lot of AI. You're going to have to take automation and treat it seriously, and figure out where humans can direct the machines to do beautiful things. But it's so weird because we have five hand carvers at our facility working nonstop to get things out, and they're back. Like, we need to hire more and more people. There's no shortage of handwork once we made it possible for people to create things again. And then there's on the digital side, are you going to like make fun of the artists who are, crafting and sculpting things in a digital program, sometimes in virtual reality. And then they go out onto the floor and they carve it when they see it with their own eyes. And there's this constant interplay between the digital model and the physical model. These are artists. This is a new medium. It's not necessarily the same medium they grew up in. Um, but it's real.
If you've been enjoying the Building Culture podcast and are listening on Apple or Spotify, could you pause for just a moment and leave a 5-star review? My goal is to get to 100 reviews. And if you do, take a screenshot and email it to playbook@buildingculture.com. Playbook, PLAYBOOK @buildingculture.com. And when we hit 100, I'll randomly pick 5 winners and send them a Building Culture hat that looks just like this. I appreciate it, and back to the show. And another thing I hear, and I'm also curious to think about myself, is just this idea of authenticity, and we hear that all the time. And there's so many different ways to debate authenticity. And one kind of quick example is I talk a lot about authenticity in our own buildings. But it's kind of a complicated thing what that actually means, and I'll give you a very simple example, is windows back in the old day, they had muntins because you couldn't make pieces of glass very big. So you have the dividers in the windows for anyone listening, and because you could have a bunch of small pieces of glass that make up the window, and you can also replace those things. Well, now we can do large pieces of glass. It's by far the most cost-effective way to do it. And then so we put that in the window, and then they call it like simulated divided light. The muntins are kind of like layered on top, kind of thing. And so early on in my career, I was kind of going, wait, when I was really talking like all just hardcore authenticity, if it's not a real beam, it's not a structural beam, I'm not putting it in. And I've really changed my mind on a lot of this stuff, because I'm going, well, what's the purpose of that? Should I just do just no muntins in any of the windows, just giant sheets of glass because it's not quote unquote authentic? And I was like, that's really stupid, Austin. So like, I need to figure out a different definition of what authentic means. But like on that topic, which this is just kind of philosophical, but what is like, how do you think about authenticity and art, and introducing robots and AI and interplay between technology and people? Do you think much about that? Do you have any conversations about that? Are people bringing things up? Like, where do you stand on all that? And I say stand, I mean, I don't mean a hard stance.
I mean, it's a big question mark for some of the artists we work with like to pretend that it's all done by hand. That's what their market or they think their buyer wants. And then we have artists who go all in on this is what the machine can do, and this is what we can create with machines. It tends to divide by age group. All the younger artists and even some of the older artists who are now experimenting in a new medium, they're giddy with excitement about what can we do with this robot that's different? How do we utilize it in a way that's different? What does it mean when we're playing with things digitally and not just working with the stone directly? It's not a settled debate what that is. And I think you're going to see the quality of the art that's coming out of our studio, and it will be different by every artist, will kind of justify it in the end. You're going to see things that are not out yet, we haven't been able to show, that are either NDA'd or they're just not released yet and will be released when they're in a gallery or in a museum. And they will look nothing like the sculpture you've seen before. They will look nothing like modernist sculpture. They won't just be like lines and things floating in the air. They'll be, what does 21st century figurative art look like? What does digital art look like when it's cast or created, put into marble? And people are still figuring that out. And I don't think everybody has figured it out yet, and they're still experimenting. But some of the stuff that's coming out is just going to be pretty mind-boggling. And if the great masters were alive today, you better believe they'd be experimenting with this stuff and figuring out how to utilize this to the utmost.
See, that's kind of my take too, is like the real artists are inventors and innovators, and they're going to use whatever's at their handset to create art, and new tools mean new possibilities. One of the comments I remember, this was, I don't know, 6 months back on Twitter or longer, but and one of the little debates, and I think people were I think you even asked when people were kind of questioning it, and you said, well, what about like, is something does its beauty change whether it was like done by a human hand or a robot? Like if you had no idea and you walked up to a piece, is there a different experience there? Something about it that's different?
Yeah, but think about the divide between like the regular art observer and artists themselves. Uh, most sculpture historically was not even didn't have the artist's hand in it at all. It was they hired studio hands or they hired a third party company like the Piccirilli brothers here in New York to just use a point system like an old XYZ plane CNC machine that you'd line up with the model and then you'd carve it into stone. And was there a difference? Did people say, "Oh, well, this was done by somebody else"? Yeah, probably. There's probably people railing against it back in the time, and we now look at this and we're like, "Ah, wasn't it so special what they used to do?" And there's no awareness of how art is actually created whatsoever. So when I deal with artists and I talk to artists and we hire artists to come on and be carvers and sculptors with us, there's really little questioning about this.
Yeah, that's interesting. About how people generally have no idea how art is created or a building is created, right? I think about that's kind of where I come back to is could you be enriched by looking at a piece of art by knowing how it was made? Absolutely. Like that's part of like I think like learning about art or something or learning about music, and then you go listen to music and you're going to have a richer experience because you understand it better. You understand how hard it is to do something. You understand the process. And so there's a greater appreciation. Most people looking at art don't know that, but we can generally still agree on what's beautiful. Not always, but most people generally agree on what's beautiful, at least in my experience. And statistically, I believe. Um,
Or like, where do people think bronzes come from? The casting process. Do they think the artist is shaping everything with their
hot
hand?
metal.
Or no, they're going to a fabricator and saying a bronze caster and saying, "Here's my model, make the bronze." And
Right.
sure, maybe they touched at the end and they clean it up. But um, are we to dismiss all of bronze casting as faux art
Right.
because it basically gets made by a fabricator? It makes no sense.
Yeah, it's the act of creating and creating beauty, and there's different ways to do that. And I think what I do like is there is still such a human element. I mean, I can understand if you start just saying, "Hey, there's not even a person involved with this. There's just some robots and AI, and they're just churning out stuff and deciding what everyone's going to live in and built and look at." Like, yeah, I would start being like, "Hold on a second." But when the tool is being used by humans, and ideally, of course, some people are going to create ugly art with that, but you don't have to have a robot or AI to create ugly art. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff out there that didn't, they did by hand.
Yeah.
They did by hand.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
I mean,
yeah,
I also think if AI comes up with an amazing 3D model and wows us with it, I have no problem seeing that as art. I have no problem
yeah,
making it. I have no problem with an AI saying, "Well, look, we've got a $200,000 budget to do this apartment building in some sort of stone. Do you want to spend $50,000 for an artist to create 80 different models for how we're gonna, put these ornaments on, or we click a button and we get 80% of the way there, and then humans can fix it up and turn to something new." I think that'd be absolutely amazing if it expands it expands what we can do with a particular budget. It's going to be really fun to see what level we can get out of AI. But we're not there yet, and we all know for a long time on the creative front, it's still going to be humans.
right. Yeah, I can see like the part that I can't, and you're already doing, but I can understand people's hesitation when it's like, let's just hand over everything to robots, and then you kind of, even if there's like some human hands, included in finishing it, but that idea of keeping the craft alive, at least where people understand how it works, just how you started off, not with a robot, you started off by hand and a chisel to understand the basics. And so, like, the way I think about it is if you're going through an apprenticeship program to be a stone carver or something, even if you're going to use robots later, just like if you're in architecture school, ideally you'd be learning how to draw by hand, even though we have computers. But just like Notre Dame, they spend 4 years drawing by hand, they don't touch a computer. I think that's awesome. And then they get into computer afterwards but they've learned the basics, and whether that's accounting or whatever it is, people actually understand. That's the concern I get of all AI. It's kind of like, okay, if you're going to be an accountant, and I get it, the AI knows a lot, but still you need to understand the back end of it, how things work, so that you can problem solve, you can be creative yourself, you can fix things. And if the AI breaks, at least there's still knowledge there. What do you think about that in terms of keeping the kind of knowledge alive of the actual how to and the handcrafting nature of it?
Uh,
Not that it's your job to do that, right? You're not training
no, we
stonemasons.
are. I mean, how many people had carving jobs in New York City before we came along? Like probably 5 to 10 people, and now we've added another five, and we'll be adding another 15, 20.
So you're actually bringing people into the
We're
trade.
bringing people into the trade. There were no jobs for them. There are no. You're not going to graduate from art school and say I'm going to be a stone carver. Now you actually can, um, and it's going to get bigger, and it's going to be in every. We'll be in multiple cities, and hopefully we'll have competitors. To be honest, and a lot of people will be doing this, and we'll all be competing to make great things. So I mean, all we're doing is scooping up every graduate from like New York Academy of Art and Grand Central Atelier and all the great art schools in New York City where people wanted to be working in stone, and instead they settled for something else. And now they get to work in stone again, and they can pay the bills with that, and they can live in New York City with that, and they can develop their own art on the side. It's bringing it back. We're reviving this craft.
And it actually lets you do a lot more as an artist, as a stone carver, right? Or something where you can, rather than work on one piece for a year or something, and you can actually, and I don't just mean for the sake of production, right? I just mean the actual experience of it. And if you still want to craft by hand, you're welcome to.
You're welcome. And we still do at certain scales, small scales, like sometimes it's just faster to craft by hand. Um, I would say that we're probably going to be less skilled at chiseling and doing massive pieces with a point system. We don't need to use a point system. And we're going to be a whole lot better at like the final finishing touches. And we use a lot of really interesting tools, some of that from the glass industry, glassware, from jewelry. We're like putting together very weird polishing, finishing bits and sanders, and diamond tip rasps. And I have one person in our studio who's like made it her mission to kind of figure out every single tool in the market and how they can be used in the most efficient and effective manner. We're playing with waxes and learning again how to finish stone in a beautiful way.
It's so cool. Like, it sounds so creative, and people centric, actually.
Yeah.
What do you think about, and this is one where I do struggle. I don't know where I land on this one. Because I just haven't debated with enough people. I'd have to like hear other perspectives, but copying great works of art, versus, original piece of art, or saying copying a not great piece of art. What, like, if someone went to you and said, I want the statue of David exactly, what would you say, and how would you think about it?
Yeah, we take commissions for all sorts of things, some of which we agree with, some of which we don't. So yeah, if somebody wants to commission it, fine. Now, there is a long history of taking existing pieces of art and reimagining them, or doing exact copies. You go to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence and you line up, you see Laocoon, you're like, wow, look at this amazing sculpture that was copied from a much older version in like 1890 or something like that. And you're like, okay, there's a tradition here. Choose what you want. Like, we don't need to copy it, but if you want to, and you found something beautiful and you want to make a new copy, like, that's great. I don't stand in the way. And I think some things you are so beautiful that you want to have a copy, and you want to, how many Rodin's thinkers are there in the world? How many versions of the same bronze are there in the world? It's really up to you what you want to, how you want to produce art. I no problem with it at all.
Yeah, that's one where I'm like, I could see, it's hard, because what is a great piece of art? I mean, most people agree, once again, but where's that cutoff? Because in my head, which I'm not being consistent here, like, I know I'm not consistent about it, but I'm kind of going, oh yeah, some of these just like amazing piece of art. If someone wants a replica of it for their private home or whatever, okay, fine. But like, it should be labeled as such or something in my head, or, like, where it's like, this is not the original.
Oh yeah, I mean, it happens all the time, right? There, you would, I just saw like at Sotheby's, like a Canova, takeoff. It's not going to sell at $1 million like an original Canova will, but somebody for $30,000 or $50,000 can have the same piece. Um, that's not made by the original master or their original studio.
Right.
Um, so there's different pieces for different segments. An artist might choose to do one massive uh, version of their work that they'll sell as a unique copy that nobody else should copy, and it's going to be very expensive. And then they'll make a series of 10. It's the same as having a print. It's different than a painting. And as long as the artist makes clear, hey, this is a series, and there's a set of 4 of these. It's just allows different price points to get involved in art. Art should not be something that only billionaires and 100 millionaires should afford. It should be able to be purchased by people at all income levels.
Yeah, I agree with that. What do you think about just architecture and meaning? Like we've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but like what gives architecture meaning and value? Because I understand why the process is part of that. I think. Um, I mean, like if something's very unethically done, right? Like we kind of as a society are going to look at that a little bit differently, even if it's a great like a masterpiece of some kind. But if it was, I don't know, done under horrible conditions or something, or people were grossly mistreated, like society is going to think a little bit differently about it.
Yeah.
But in terms of architecture and buildings, and most people don't know the stories and don't know how things are getting built. Where is the meaning in it? Do you think like where, especially where I'm kind of bringing together where people are worried about losing the meaning by using robots?
Yeah. I we see very little meaningful architecture done today, and it's not because I hate all modern buildings or I hate modernist architecture. It's simply a matter of how much architecture is thoughtful about its viewers and its users, and give back to people who are using it. It's not just an economic floor space spreadsheet uh, creation. Uh, the reason I think so many people like old architecture versus new architecture is because in many, many instances, instances, there was a sense of the developer and the architect and the artist giving back through detail and attention to how it would be viewed by others, and interest and intricate. Every time I see that an intricate design, whether it's a piece of repeated terracotta or it's an originally carved piece of stone, it's amazing to me that anybody even thought to do this. Because today, you would never imagine there was ever possible an age where anything but the economic return on that asset was given any thought. And everything I rock now, I'm on the Upper West Side now, and I walk around, and everything pre-war expresses some sort of intention to do better. Um, and when modernist architecture does that, in many cases it does. Usually, it takes very large budgets. Usually, it's very, very highly skilled, well-known architects. It's amazing too, and it produces an incredible effect as well. Um, but the fact is that 99.9% of things that are built today don't show anything. I guess they're the function of a brand of finance and maybe a culture that doesn't seem to care or says, well, if I do care, I'm not going to get a return on it because everybody else is putting up such junk. So that's all it is. I think as soon as you recognize that the building had people who cared about you and thought about your experience with it, um, you're in new territory.
I think that's a really nice way to think about it. You mentioned like I grew up in the suburbs of Houston, and kind of quintessential suburban sprawl, just all of it built, since the '60s onward, and just not much worth celebrating. In the new stuff, there's some amazing areas, but they're the old historic areas. But I remember right before going to KPMG, so this is 2011, right before going to my accounting job, I had just graduated. I'd made some money at an internship, so I went off and backpacked through Spain and Portugal on my own. And I'd been to Italy for like a couple weeks in college at one point, which I think that really kind of got my mind going. But it was those 3 months just backpacking my own through these places and just being. I didn't have the language for architecture. I had no background in art or architecture. Like I wouldn't have known what a hip roof was, right, or a dormer specifically. Um, but just walking around being, this is incredible. And I didn't have language and I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know what I was feeling. But just looking back, I think what I was feeling at the time was, golly, I grew up thinking we were at the pinnacle of all of human, progress. And I've just been told about how amazing America is, that America is the great experiment, the light of the world. And we are in many, I mean, there's some just unbelievable things about America. But when you go and look at these places that were built 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and of course, people spend billions to go there every year just to spend 1 week in these places. You're going, I mean, it was like a brain thing that like it wasn't competing. I was like, what? And of course, I knew nothing about real estate. It was like, how does this exist? And we're building this. Like I couldn't. And then I went and worked at my accounting job, and I only made it a year and 3 months because like something's off. Like I can't do this anymore. I've got to go figure out what's going on with the world because none of this makes sense to me. Gosh, I forgot where I was kind of going with that. But the and you also mentioned about the like, what is it? Culturally and stuff, maybe people just don't appreciate this. And I've started thinking about this a lot at building culture. There's a reason we call it building culture. Building culture, the construction culture, the culture of construction, the bricks and sticks, and then building culture. And originally, I've really been focused on the construction culture, figuring out the bricks and sticks, the R&D, understanding how it works, all of that. And now I'm really shifting into the culture aspect because the bricks and sticks is maybe 50% of the equation. Because if people, it's not just about like educated. I don't mean, did they go to some university or something? That's not what I mean at all.
Mm-hmm.
But if people aren't aware enough to see beauty and appreciate it, if they're so, and which is hard because in American culture, and I'm not in New York, New York is so uniquely different than almost anywhere else in the country. But everything is just so like destination driven, where it's just like there's this sea of ugliness, and then like let's go to this destination over here to go eat, and then let's go to a sea of ugliness forever to go to this destination over here to go to the doctor or to go shop or go to the school, whatever, and this destination over here. And I wonder if it almost kind of like numbs us to actually attention and appreciation, because we kind of have to, because driving at 70 miles an hour down a Strode at 30 miles an hour doesn't feel good. So we kind of have to turn off all those senses. And then it's like, gosh, I went to a basketball game a few weeks ago, and I don't mean to be disrespectful about it, but it was just like so loud. And like, it's like music. It's like barely a sports game because there's like basketball, but it's like giant music. And then there's a pause, and then people run out of the thing. And then there's it's just like, whoa, like so overstimulating. Like what happened to just like watching a basketball game? And I don't know, so I think about this in relation to architecture and people being able to access it, but that really isn't about how the architecture was made or built, whether that was by human hands or by robot hands. It's us,
So I think you've touched on the big question mark of all of this, which is it culture or is it economics? What drove us to abandon a way of building and led to the state of affairs we're in? Behind Monumental Labs is a hypothesis that at least partially, but probably maybe in a big way, economics is what's the cause of the downfall of our built environment. That culture is shaped by what can be done within an economic system. And that hypothesis is that working in the types of things we did pre-war became too expensive as human labor costs rose. And the other side of that is, well, no, we stopped wearing fedoras. We like started dressing down. I don't know how this all ties together. I don't know what came first, but I think a prerequisite for a beautiful building culture is building economics that actually makes sense. And if you're building in a certain way, if you're building in concrete, it becomes very hard and cost ineffective to tack on a piece of stone that is carved by a human or even by a robot if you're just having to create an entirely new structure that doesn't make any sense. The counterpoint to this is Well, on the economic side, it's like, oh, even tenements in New York City got decorated with beautiful cornices and details and interesting, window casements and all of that. And is that because we all thought it was undignified to live in a very boring, flat faced building, and our friends would not accept us if we did anything differently? Or was it just cheap enough that you could do it? And the expectation from the public was, oh, you don't have a cornice. What's wrong with this landlord? Well, yeah. Or was it the market for renting out an apartment was so competitive that you had to offer something beyond just floor space? Um, Disaggregating this and figuring out what it is, I don't know if we'll ever find out. But I think that lowering the cost of building in the way we want to build is going to be a prerequisite for doing anything. Uh, I think you're probably experiencing this in your business. The question I always think about with you is your costs are definitely higher for building in brick. Does the market accept it? And also, for you, does it maybe not matter? And even if you're not making as much money as somebody else, why aren't there more people copying you? Why aren't there more people who are trying to build in structural masonry? So this is the great debate, but at least I have an experiment going that we'll see if it can get results.
I think that's great. Like you're like, it's right. I don't know if you'll ever get to the answer of what comes first, because I think it's both, right? There's self-reinforcing and all that, but economics, you can't solve it without solving economics. That's for sure. Like, because I talk to developers all the time that want to do something and then they can't because it can't afford it. And of course, that's also partially capital markets and how capital works and wants a really quick exit and all that, which is kind of a cultural thing, but also comes from having not very sound money, so there's a lot of like things that even go into that. But no, I think that lowering the cost will enable things. And that's why I think about, like, you mentioned, why did we stop doing it? It's because we didn't have the money. And I'm sure that's partially some of the answer, but also, a lot of this kind of happened after World War II. And you hear this, people were traumatized after this just unbelievable, like this human destruction on a scale we've never seen before, ever. I don't know if you've ever listened to Dan Carlin, but he like describes, the Genghis Khan and like wars back in the day versus like World War II. And it was like one day World War II killed more people than like all just wild, the scale of human destruction and what that probably does to the psyche and all that. And then you definitely see a very much shift after World War II. So there's a cultural component as well. And of course, I love Winston Churchill's quote, like, first we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. And so if you start not being able to afford to do beautiful things, also there's some cultural things, you start putting out uglier things, then people growing up have never even seen beautiful things, like me growing up in the suburbs of Houston. You just think this is normal, and it doesn't take very long. It takes a couple generations, and then suddenly you don't have anyone that remembered what's possible. All you see is what's around you, and as humans, we just generally accept what's around us as kind of like the reality, and it must be a good reason it's this way. Who am I to question why the world looks the way it is?
Yeah.
It's taken me almost 36 years to start seriously being like, what the hell? And feeling quite confident in questioning it.
But we got new materials. We also had way more people joining the middle class who in the past would live in a tiny little apartment, and maybe they'd get a detail on their exterior that they liked. And, our wealth was increased dramatically when we built uglier things for a time, and we housed more people in higher quality houses and apartments. So there's something to that, right? It makes me feel better when I think of like the sadness of suburbia. It's like, well, in a certain way, it's better than everybody being crammed into like 4 families in an apartment on the Lower East Side. Like at some level, this has to happen, and there are going to be places that aren't beautiful. What bothers me is that the places that are wealthy and could afford it and are at the center of the financial world here in New York choose to make buildings that are ugly, and sometimes they can't do any better. But no, it didn't come. It's not a mystery that like modernism like came out of this trauma, but also it came out of some really interesting intellectual ideas. And man, if you were walking around and 100% of New York City was like little chintzy things and columns everywhere, like printed en masse, like what Mies was doing with the Seagram building was friggin' fantastic. And Lever House was fantastic. It like played off of all of this traditional architecture and looks like these alien orbs that have flown into the city. And they're great. I would love to be able to walk around New York City in 1965, like when there's still so much that's remaining, but also these new glass shimmering towers in the middle of everything. But what happened is, I don't know. I don't know what happened to the degradation of architecture as a craft, but it just became putting up square footage. And perhaps our housing shortage explains it. Like, we don't have the luxury of hoping for something beautiful. We just need enough space to put people. And it's all cyclical. You build ugly things and everybody stops trying to build. And then we're stuck because we become NIMBYs, and I don't want to see another ugly building in a historic district. I want to see something that competes with something that came before. Yeah, let's get rid of some like 6-story old tenement buildings and put up like a 30-story amazing condos that have their own personality. Let's do that, but we have to make it beautiful first.
I think that's a really great way to think about it. You know, what do you see? How do you envision kind of the future of architecture and all that? I mean, kind of even if you make it even personal with Monumental Labs, of just, you know, kind of the rest of your life, like what do you kind of see being able to happen, your vision for it? And
I see us returning to our tradition of building in stone. I don't think 30 years from now you will be putting up a concrete and steel building. I think you will actually be putting up stone taken out of the ground that doesn't have to be manufactured, that has, 96% less carbon intensiveness than steel and concrete. It's going to be structural stone, post-tensioned, a thin steel wire, keeping everything compressed. And you're going to be building 50-story buildings out of stone again. And that's going to be the default way we build things. And once you do that, you're in the material that we can use to decorate things. The pillars and the lintels that we use to build buildings can actually be operated on, and they'll turn into our new, facing facades of the cathedral with their own pediments and stories written on them, because we can, and because it's not too much money once you're already building out of stone to just shape that stone. I think the costs will be coming down tremendously. I think AI will help us manufacture detail and custom detail with barely a blip in the construction budget. And we can talk about structural stone all day, and we can talk about how brick fits into that. But I think the long century wait of getting away from natural materials that are there for the taking is coming to an end.
Man, I really love that vision, and I love that it's bold too, but very possible. As we, for everyone listening, steel and concrete buildings, I mean, they can function well long term, but a lot of reinforced concrete ends up failing fairly quickly because the steel rusts and blows out the concrete. And so, the way I talk about in terms of brick, like I've really backed off, like, brick, it's got to, I really care more about masonry-based construction systems. That's really what we're at building culture, is masonry-based construction systems. And it's not, a triple wide wall or blah, blah, blah. It's, the reason being is resiliency and points of failure. If you want something to last, one, it has to be beautiful. It's got to be useful. But it's also got to be durable. And what is durable? There is no perfect building system. Everything has weaknesses. The moment I bring up structural masonry, I cannot believe how many people start being like, but what about seismic and earthquakes? And you're going, guys, like, everything has weaknesses. I can say, wood framed has to fire and water and termites and rot and mold, vulnerabilities. So it's about finding the systems that have the fewest vulnerabilities and then controlling for catastrophic failures, and hence the tension ties you just talked about. And then the masonry is just so much more resilient and can take substantial periods of neglect, which is why I think it can last so long, because you're talking about something about not just lasting for 100 years, but hundreds of years. You're talking about major economic cycles, of there could be utter poverty for 150 years. And then for a building to be able to be brought back to life, it has to last in dilapidation for a long time. And masonry, while it still needs maintained, it can last a lot longer unmaintained than a wood frame. If you don't keep that thing painted well, or if it's a steel and concrete building, if you don't keep all of the water out, it's going to fail.
Oh yeah, and you know, the masonry buildings will also incorporate wood. You're not going to need you know, all of the floor plates and all the joists. They don't have to be all stone. There's going to be CLT involved, but the main piers that hold up the building, and some of the main lintels will be stone. And what's going to be great about it is actually, you know, if you want to knock that building down, you're going to actually take that stone down and just use it somewhere else.
Right.
There's going to be
Can't do that with steel and concrete.
Yep, yep. They're going to be held together and they're going to be unmoved when you take them apart. Maybe they'll shift in the soil. We'll see. Maybe there's some rot on the inside, but you'll just be able to use those stone beams once again.
Man, so last thing I'll tell you, you mentioned floor systems, and I was going to say this. I'll send you a link after, but there's a podcast that I'm dropping next week with Philip Block Research Group out of Zurich. Guy I met in Spain last summer when I was studying there, and they are doing unbelievable things with unreinforced, lightweight concrete. They're taking, and here's an example. If you take just a normal floor system in a building, commercial building, you know, where it's steel and concrete, and he was using an example of a 25-story building. Well, now that I'm understanding a little bit more about engineering and stuff, but basically there's just so much waste in the material, and I also didn't realize that. Oh gosh, I'm going to get this wrong. I forget what percent of the mass of the building. I think 60% of the mass of a modern commercial building is in the floor system, which is just insane. And whether you're talking about the number of concrete trucks, the amount of steel in it, and so he's developed this floor system, kind of doing the same thing, blending old knowledge but with new technology, and really using graphic statics to shape the geometry of the floor system and basically cutting out all this unnecessary stuff. So when you're looking up at the bottom of it, kind of looks like a web. And then there's actually, you know, a flat piece on top, and the flat piece is 1 inch. That's actually the part you're like standing on, completely unreinforced. He drops them in, and these right now are being molded, but could be cast. I think they're being cast right now, and maybe one day they could be 3D printed or not. I don't know. And then drops them in, cinches them together with an external tension tie, all 100% in compression. And get this, it saves something like 80% of materials. And on a 25-story building, it saves 1,200 concrete trucks and 20 kilometers of steel.
Oh.
And it's so cool. And would work beautifully. Like, I want to get these in our structural masonry building at some point, but I'm just getting really excited about what you're doing, what he's doing, the actual very, very, very real possibilities of us, even at Building Culture, being able to incorporate some of these things in my lifetime. Like, oh, that gets me so jazzed.
Yeah, it won't be very long. Yeah, we're hard at work setting up a system and even partnering with some people who have already started working on these systems to be able to just ship to your site, you know, completed post-tensioned or pre-tensioned steel masonry beams, and there's going to be a question of getting all the resources and together to build like this. You're going to need a crane, you know, somewhere between 5 and 8 ton crane. Actually, not that hard to achieve, but the way we construct buildings is going to have to change a little. You're going to have the infrastructure for all of it. And you're going to have to be able to prove to the market that the costs are lower or the costs are similar, and you're saving, you know, 97% or 96% of the carbon. So yeah, there's going to be some work to get there, and we'll figure out a way to either get really interesting projects to subsidize it at the beginning, or get VC money to subsidize it at the beginning, and start building the ecosystem.
Well, we plan to be, you know, as I've told you, we've been pretty slow, just as well. COVID was pretty rough on the business, and I was already moving and starting over in Oklahoma City when we first met, you know, so I've gone off to a pretty slow start. But with our development coming up that'll be breaking ground later this year, we're absolutely going to be ordering stuff for you. And I don't know exactly how much yet, because we have to work in the realm of economics, and things are 40% more expensive today than they used to be 4 years ago. It costs us 40% more to build. So we'll be actually using concrete block, going back to that masonry.
Well, we're the only thing that's cost is going down in that case.
Wow.
But Well, the great thing is you can come to me with a budget, say, oh, we have 100K, we have 50K, and I can tell you what you can get out of that
Yeah.
before we even start. And if your budget is light, you start realizing a lot of the old buildings around you must have had very different budgets. Because if you can do shallow, even a little bit of high relief, but mostly like medium or low relief, you can cover a whole wall in low relief. If you want to like put up a full statue, you're gonna pay for it because you have to do all sides. Um, but we could craft ornament that gets repeated, for instance. And when you repeat it, and we don't have to keep programming it, we can make 20 out of one run on a robot and just set it, and it works for 2-3 days straight. We don't have to do work because that's not what costs a lot of money. What costs a lot of money is us setting it up and calibrating it and designing it and doing the tool paths. So we can give you blocks, 100 of the same block with the same design going across,
See, that's what I'm talking about. Sills, the stuff like that, decorative pieces just to put in one-sided. And I love the patterns that are going to be possible, where we've done some with sandblasting, but you're just so limited there. Versus like, I love some Islamic architecture and all the patterns and geometries in there and the intricacies in that. And to be able to start using that in our architecture, I'm just so stoked about.
We're not inventing all this stuff, right? Terracotta is just, keep repeating.
Yeah.
And figure out cool ways to do it. We'll figure out something cool.
Well, I'm excited. We'll have to have you on again after we've installed some stuff.
Yeah, we'll do a walkthrough
in Townsend, which would be 2025 by the time it's actually vertical and some done.
No worries. We definitely need to get a whole lot more robots to just cover what we're already booked up for now. So by 2025,
well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that.
We should be in a position.
So, Micah, if anyone else listening wants to get in touch or just follow you, how do people follow you, get in touch with you, order, some robot stones?
Yeah, go to our website, sign up, monumentallabs.co.co. You can email me. It's just micah@monumentallabs.co. You can direct message me on Twitter or X. You can find me on Instagram. You can find Monumental Labs on Instagram and Twitter. A lot of the billionaires and those types of people just see what we're posting and DM me that they want to create like 10 sculptures in a mansion that has, a $2 million sculpture budget. And
you stepped into the right business, the right time.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's just an appetite for this stuff. And we're going to get beyond our 2 robots. Hopefully it's 20 pretty soon and
incredible.
Pump things out.
Well, rooting for you, Micah, and what you're doing and what it's going to be allow, frankly, me and us and everyone else to be able to do. I think it's a critical piece of the puzzle, being able to build more beautiful, durably for humans.
It's working with developers like you who are thoughtful and this is where the creativity comes in. It's going to be our collaboration that kind of establishes a new style of architecture. So we'll put our heads together on how to do that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Micah.
Thanks, Austin.
Boy, that conversation and what Mike is doing just gets me really excited about future possibilities, not just at building culture, which we, by the way, plan to absolutely be working with and ordering Micah, frankly, from here on out, but really starting with our Townsend project, that urban infill mixed-use neighborhood I've been talking about that'll break ground later this year with houses probably coming out of the ground 2025. So it's going to be really fun to see what's all possible here with decorative stonework, and really bringing the cost down with not just decorative work, but also even just mass wall masonry and stone masonry construction, post-tension stuff. I mean, gosh, I find this really exciting because it's not just about the robots and the AI or the technology. It's about how we can use that and harness that in service of humans, in service of beauty. And I think that's what Michael and his mission at Monumental Labs is really doing. So anyway, really stoked about the possibilities here. I'll have to have him on again, frankly, and maybe another year when we use some of this stuff, worked with him. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate it if you would like, subscribe, and share. And if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave a 5-star review. It really helps. Once we get to 100 reviews, by the way, if you do leave a review, take a screenshot, send it to playbook@buildingculture.com. And once we hit 100, you'll be entered in to win just one of our Building Culture hats that we all wear here, and I will ship it to you myself. Really appreciate it, and catch you on the next episode.